I hope I'm going live about now. My iPad has not yet confirmed that to me, but I'll just trust in the universe and in my somewhat decent internet connection, though I really should connect to Ethernet at some point. Regardless, hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to a new episode with MarkTech. I apologize for my voice being a little hoarse. I had a really long phone call in the cold outside, so I hope it will normalize as we go through this live stream, a live stream that I hope will not be too long. We are covering a couple of topics that came out basically in the last week, or one or two maybe being even a little longer in the tooth. I apologize, obviously I have had my somewhat long hiatus, but I am back and I'm very happy to be covering new stuff. Now, first and foremost, this is basically a public service announcement from me, and this concerns the new M3 MacBook Air, both the 13 and 15-inch models. Now, let me make one thing clear. I 100% believe that the M3 and especially M3 Pro MacBook Pros are better deals overall, because I really enjoy their ProMotion screens. I really enjoy their large batteries, having more USB-C ports, especially on the M3 Pro models. However, I understand that budgets sometimes do not just conform to raw value. They conform to sometimes a hard cap. So for those people, I really can highly recommend the M3 MacBook Air models. And what is even better is, after now almost 2 years of complaining from the guys at MaxTech, first and foremost Vadim Yurev, we now have the confirmation with the M3 MacBook Air, which is interesting because this does put it in contrast with the M3 iMac that we got not too long ago. Yes, the 256GB of base storage might be the same in terms of raw capacity, and so are the 8GB of RAM that are 6400 megatransfers per second. Yet what has changed is something that we actually used to have a while ago with the M1 versions, and that is significantly faster SSD speeds that are pretty close to maxing out like PCIe 3.0 by 4 speeds, while on the M2 version we had, instead of 2 modules that you need to saturate that kind of speed on Apple's motherboards, you had only one module. And Apple told us that was because of logistical reasons, that they had no basically access to a lot of 128GB modules, so they were using one 256GB module instead. Well, now we do have two 128GB modules, just as we had back in the day of the M1 MacBook Air, and this results in significantly faster speeds. In fact, when you look at it comparatively to the M2 base model, we now have 33% faster write speeds. Write speeds were never that big of a problem, even on the somewhat neutered down M2, but what has gotten significantly faster, and what will be really important when it comes to RAM utilization as well, is read speeds. Now, for those of you who don't know, Macs and basically any other modern operating system uses a system called swap, which means if your RAM is full, then your storage basically acts like another RAM. Now, that might be much slower than actual RAM, however, it is still somewhat usable, especially on modern SSDs. If you obviously have a way slower SSD as we had before, well, now, that sucks. Well, if you have 82% faster read speeds now, that swap capability is much better, and of course, just working with large files that you have on your drive and everything else will be smoother. But as I said, the swap functionality, especially for the base model that still comes unfortunately with 8 gigs of RAM, my wish of M3 being the beginning of 12 gigabytes of memory as a base configuration, unfortunately not being realized this generation. However, at least we get something, right? So the guys from MaxTech have a video, please check it out. to give them your support. They do some really good teardowns. They do some really good like gen to gen comparisons. They even do some comparisons with Windows devices that usually are pretty good, except for when they're sponsored. I apologize. There were 1 or 2 videos that I really didn't like, but they do have a video about the M3 MacBook Air teardown saying Apple fixed the MacBook Air. However, if you go to their channel, you will also find the video of them heavily complaining about how much this machine throttles, given that it doesn't have active cooling, nor does it have very extensive or expensive passive cooling. If you check out like the thin layer of aluminum that usually would be covering that motherboard, that is not very good at cooling. Now you could like build in like into the MacBook Air yourself, like DIY some thermal pads, but those can actually cause way too much heat buildup because the system does not actually know that well when like overall temperature saturation across the aluminum chassis happens. So I really wouldn't recommend it. However, this does noticeably improve the base experience, and given that the 13-inch MacBook Air actually used to start at $1199 when it launched, and it had that GIMP based storage, and now you have that faster storage at a base price of $1099, which the 13-inch MacBook Air was reduced in price around the time the 15-inch MacBook Air was introduced. Well, now you have a much better value base configuration, but I would argue, since I usually recommend people get 512 gigabytes and 16 gigabytes of RAM, you now get that for $1499. Yes, that is a lot more expensive obviously than $1099. However, at that price you also now happen to get the full 10-core GPU version of the M3, and you get all the other improvements of the M3 MacBook Air, which includes Wi-Fi 6E, the better coding for the midnight color. So yeah, it's not a lot, but given that it's only $100 more expensive than the M2 version in the lineup, unless you can get the M2 version at a really highly discounted price, I actually recommend you get the M3 version. I know a lot of people will usually jump up on the fact that like, yeah, but like the old version is like so heavily discounted. Maybe if the price gap becomes higher than $250, but everything above that, I'll just say get yourself the more future-proof, faster M3 version with better Wi-Fi and stuff like that. Supposedly in some tests the speakers have performed a little better, but it's basically a negligible difference. So I highly recommend this MacBook Air if your budget is really limited in comparison to the rest of Apple's lineup. Not that these devices are cheap by any means in the broader industry, but if you really want something under $2,000, maybe even under $1,800, maybe even under $1,600, depending on the size, right? The version of the 15-inch model that I would recommend with 16 gigabytes and 512 gigabytes does come up to $1,700 overall, but I still believe it's a pretty decent value, especially the 15-inch version. Also, like, it is just a size that you don't really get at Apple for a low price historically. It's only since they introduced that model. Now, we have had sales data that suggested that this model actually underperformed Apple's expectations, but yeah, I wouldn't get my panties in a wad about sales numbers for Apple. Just get what is best for you, and I think these devices are pretty good. And with this, I can actually recommend, if you know you can really get by with 256 gigabyte, maybe consider getting 16 gigs of RAM, or just get the base model and then consider upgrading maybe a year sooner than you otherwise would have given the budget. So this is some really good news to start, something I really wanted to cover because as you guys know, I interact a lot with you on Twitter, and yeah, Twitter is a mess, but I've managed it as well as I can in order for like the good stuff to come up and for our conversations to be somewhat productive. And this was really a topic I saw people online discuss. It even hit like some of my friends who are like not very tech savvy, but usually are pretty in the know about like what's really hot about Apple right now. So this seems to have had some positive PR for Apple. Now, this was the MacBook Air. Obviously, this is what came out this week or last week, whenever you're watching this. Maybe it came out a year ago if you're watching this sometime in 2025. However, we also are still expecting the M3 iPad Pro, and that is obviously way more interesting to me because I don't have any plans of upgrading my MacBook Pro M1 Max anytime soon. I might upgrade my iPad Pro, maybe even not this generation, but the next or something like that. By that I mean like I won't be buying the M3 OLED iPad Pro, but it's a model that I really want to test out, that I really want to understand just how much better the screen is, just how much the M3 impacts performance, whether it throttles inside the iPad. So really interesting generational like perspective, especially if Apple goes even thinner. The MacBook Air is not as exciting, but hey, at least it's better value than the last generation was at launch, and that is, I believe, something worth celebrating. When we actually look to much bigger releases, but that aren't unfortunately as close as the iPad Pro most likely is, well, when we think about the iPhone 16 generation this year, well, we mostly usually discuss the iPhone 16 Pro, and we'll get to talking about the iPhone 16 Pro. In fact, that's the main topic I want to discuss today. So this is actually partially why the stream is not that long today. But we have some leaked schematics for both iPhone 16 and 16 Pro, and you will see me comment on both. Now, the first one for the iPhone 16 actually comes from Majin Buu on X, which, as you guys know, is not a 100% trustworthy account, whether it's due to deliberate misinformation or due to inadequate research or just sharing out sources that weren't adequately vetted or something like that. Majin Buu has a very mixed track record, but still has some relevance in the leaker crowd. This is why I usually don't like making videos that are entirely focused on stuff from Majin Buu, but I will usually include stuff from him if it's a larger, more analytic piece like this, I guess you could call it. And so what I have found here is that for a while the iPhone 16 has now been rumored to be our first somewhat major like camera housing redesign on the iPhone. Basically on the Pro models the camera housing has stayed like the triangle plus flash plus LiDAR for a while. On the dual camera iPhones we've had like them change to a diagonal layout. Now supposedly we are changing back to a vertical layout of the two cameras. However, there is the discussion that it won't look just like before, but it will be noticeably different, and it will actually look like this. Now, the best way I can describe it is an iPhone X/XS camera design, but instead of having the elevated metal that basically houses the cameras, instead you still get that basically that small lift of the actual glass, so like a 3D effect. It's not anything new at this point, we've had that since the iPhone 11 generation, but it looks pretty nice, it feels pretty nice. Some people don't obviously like it, but I pretty much enjoy it. So, but instead of this being basically a square, this is now more of like a squircle, tangle, or whatever you want to call this, basically. It's just enough to house the 2 cameras and the microphone, not so the flash. The flash would sit outside, but in a somewhat centered way, basically creating a little bit of the triangle effect that you see from the Pro models. But it's somewhat reminiscent of some Android phones we have right now. I personally probably would end up liking it, because I don't think this is actually a super major change. But I kind of understand why Apple might feel like doing this, because for years we have had people call out Apple for like not changing designs, even though for years people called out Apple for being only form over function. So now that they're actually prioritizing function, people are now complaining, oh, the camera housing looks exactly the same year to year. I personally highly disagree with that, but it is what it is. People are weird, and this is supposedly what it's gonna look like. That being said, we have not had a lot of sources for now confirming this. Maybe over the course of the next couple of months we'll start seeing a lot more stuff from people who are like case manufacturers. Those people usually get access to CAD files and schematics much earlier than everyone else. So let's see what happens then. Now, however, the reason why I've said I don't cover Majin Buu in videos where he is the only source, well, because this is what would happen if I made videos based on Majin Buu as the only source, right? This is what he suggested the camera housing would basically look like for the 16 Pro models. The idea here is, I've actually contacted him on Twitter and he responded to me. That square, you should kind of rationalize it away. He posted basically a schedule of this. But then I asked him, like, well, depending on what people actually told you, your sources, did they say like that fidget spinner is on top of that squircle, or is it instead of the squircle? Because this is obviously a very different design paradigm if you have both elements. And he basically suggested to me that it would be instead of the squircle, so it wouldn't sit on top of that, it would be its own elevation. Now, we don't know if it would be elevated from the glass housing, from the glass chassis, or just the glass backside, I guess, like in the 3D way that it currently is, or if it's just basically stands erect, like more like an iPhone 10 or 10s camera housing. And we had discussions on whether it would be like basically a triangle with rounded off edges, or this fidget spinner design where it somewhat hugs like the line of the circles inside. It looks absolutely ridiculous, absolutely unbelievable, especially inside that squircle. But this is what Majin Buu suggested, and yes, it is complete garbage. And most likely what will actually be happening, and this is where we get to, in my opinion, the most interesting news of today, is that we actually had CAD leaks, so basically pretty good dimensions of the iPhone 16 Pro, and this is actually comes from 91 Mobiles directly. So I'm covering a direct source that's an exclusive of theirs, and what it does, it gives you very believable, I would say, like sizing of the actual device. Now, it does not try to tell you there would be a fidget spinner inside here, and what it also does, it's actually pretty believable as a source, because historically 91 Mobiles has actually been one of the few websites to really accurately leak CAD files and stuff like that, based on supposedly their relationship with like case manufacturers, because as I said, those are the people who need much earlier access to CAD files, and this would actually be really interesting if this will basically be another plus in their portfolio of successes when it comes to leaking accurate iPhone data. Now, what does those leaked CAD renders show? Well, for one, as I said, they do show a familiar camera bump. They do show a new button that I will also explain a little later on. And the capture button is below that power button. However, that does not mean that this is our only button change on the device, because the action button itself that we just got on the 15 Pro is also getting larger. And if we actually return to the iPhone 16 leak, it does not actually show us the action button getting larger like this. So this further actually decreases, in my eyes, the accuracy of this leak. And hopefully this leak here is actually pretty accurate, because I really like it. There are larger dimensions overall, and it could feature a bigger screen. It should be noted that you can never really tell this unless like Apple also provides 100% accurate like bezel comparisons up front, and you can make like guesstimates from a CAD file like this that isn't like 100% like labeled in terms of every dimension that you see. Usually, obviously, Apple, for their developers and case manufacturers, does label how big are the bezels and stuff like that, because that, for example, is important for manufacturing like screen covers. However, here we do get like height, width, and thickness. We don't necessarily get all those small details around that, which it's like interesting. I mean, I couldn't tell you, for example, if the camera housing itself has gotten larger over the 15 Pro, because the 15 Pro has a huge one anyway. Supposedly the 16 Pro generation is getting the larger, like 16% larger main sensor. So let's see how that works out. Supposedly, the ultra-wide camera goes from 12 megapixels to 48 with a much larger sensor, and the 15 Pro is getting the 5x telephoto that is inside the 15 Pro Max. The 16 Pro will be getting the 5x telephoto with the tetra prism design from the 15 Pro Max right now. So in my opinion, if those rumors are all true, even for like the small 16 Pro, kind of would suggest to me that this camera housing is probably bigger than it was on the 15 Pro, but I cannot really tell you. Maybe somebody who's like a real nerd for math can do that for me. Maybe you can just do like really accurate like size by size comparison and overlays, but let's see. The other thing is, so this is getting larger overall, but let's look from the side, which is where the more interesting stuff is. For one, the action button. To anybody who has like a 15 Pro model, you know that this action button is significantly larger than before, and it's actually way closer in size to the volume buttons. I believe it's still a little smaller, but that will make finding it way easier if you're trying to activate it like basically fresh out of your pants. And then on the other side, and this is still a little unclear to me, is we finally basically have a somewhat decent like leak of the capture button, which sits basically symmetrically on the other side of the power button, but on the same side, you know what I mean, right? From a height perspective here. It's also very similar in size overall. It's supposedly a little thicker. Now, from what I understand, this is not an actual physical button, but again, we've also had some people put that into question. Like supposedly this is like a haptic feedback button, so it will basically respond very similar to your Magic Trackpad for your Macs. I don't know, to be quite honest. I don't know if there's like any like official thing about that, but obviously nothing is official until Apple has confirmed it. So but I mean, like, we haven't heard Mark Gurman come out, for example, and specifically talk about the capture button being either like recessed or a full-on button. His original reporting suggested that it would be just a haptic feedback button, so this is what I'm basing it on. But but obviously a month passes and a lot of stuff can change. Apple might have some kind of other prototype that they are trying out at the same time, and then they change their mind. Now, that is unlikely, but it's possible, and I don't want to report wrong stuff to you. For example, with like the iPhone 14 series and 15 series, especially the 14 series, though, we have had like USB-C rumors for months and months after launch of the iPhone 13, and still the iPhone 14 Pro and the entire 14 series overall ended up still having Lightning. So there can be actually rumors weeks and months even after the launch of an iPhone that its successor that end up being completely wrong. So I just really want to make sure I'm not hanging out my hat to the guillotine for this. I hope that this is correct, because I rather like the placement of the buttons here, and to me it doesn't really matter whether it's haptic or an actual button, because I do trust Apple knowing their magic keyboards with their haptic buttons. And given that it seems like both the action button and especially the power button are still like regular buttons, I also don't see any problems with this being a haptic feedback button, because like all your turn device on or off, put it in restore mode and stuff like that, it would still work with a regular button. So I wouldn't worry, at least about that. So iPhone 16 is rumored to be an incremental update. I actually would say there are so many small incremental changes in the 16 that are being discussed, from obviously a change from A17 to A18 Pro chip with supposedly much better cooling, a new modem both for Wi-Fi and for cellular. We do have those button updates, as I said, the significant camera changes across main camera, ultra wide, and the zoom camera for the smaller Pro model. I would argue once you combine a lot of that together, it becomes more than iterative updates, especially considering that sometimes even big design changes don't actually change that many internals, right? So I think that S years are kind of understated, and in polls actually they poll really well as like really like finely tuned devices that people really like. But when the media talks about them, they're more like, oh, no big design change or no big change in the iPhone experience, and I tend to really disagree with that take. So those are cut renders exclusively by 91 Mobiles. The new iPhone 16 Pro will continue using the same design language, supposedly also continuing their use of titanium. So we do have the capture button, which is showing up below the power button, which is interesting because in the US, where you can see that capture button is where the millimeter wave antenna would kind of be. I don't know if that means the millimeter wave antenna like moves maybe to the other side or something, or whether Apple finally removes it, because clearly nobody uses millimeter wave. It just makes the device unnecessarily expensive. It eats up extra internal space because you need that for like the extra antenna stuff. So in my opinion, I would be perfectly fine. And especially Apple never brought 5G millimeter wave to any place outside the US. And it is just such a weird discrepancy given that even the US doesn't really invest in it that much anymore. So I would much rather see no millimeter wave at all and better internal space usage rather than the button and then millimeter wave moving to another place. So for one, I do want to deal with the capture button at first. The button, which is capacitive touch functionality, so this would line up with it not being like basically higher than the actual body. So they do run with the story that Mark Gurman has originally suggested. It would enable new functionality that I do want to break down a little later, and you can see it's pretty big, so it's much more usable as an actual like camera shutter button than an action button is, but that's what I use the action button for right now. So this would be a way better solution and open up up the use of the action button for other functionality. Again, at least for me. I know some people just keep it on mute, but a lot of people that I know switched it to camera. So this would be really, really cool for those people. The other point is, as I've said before, the size overall is larger, which would line up with previous rumors that we are also getting a size increase of the display on the 16 Pro models. So the 16 Pro, according to this schematics, will be 149.6 millimeters times 71.4 times 8.4. So height, width, and thickness. Now, when we actually look at it percentage wise, those are incredibly small changes, right? Here we just have like 3 millimeter, I'm sorry, it's not 3 millimeters, it's 0.3, wait, is it? No, it's 3 millimeters taller. Exactly. I apologize. Here we have like less than 1 millimeter difference in width. So even though I know people prefer like thinner phones, or not thinner phones, but less wide phones overall, I don't think that this will make or break your experience. And it is once again thicker. The iPhone 15 Pro is actually noticeably thicker than previous generations, but now we're going up again from 8.25 to a whole 8.4 millimeters. So overall the dimensions don't change that much, but once you combine them, it kind of gives you a little bit of an impression what you possibly should expect. For one, if the bezels are actually the same, this would really line up with a 6.3 inch display taking over from a 6.1 inch display. And then if the 16 Pro Max is similarly increased in size, then this is where we would go from 6.7 inches to 6.9 inches. Some even suggested that the 16 Pro could have even thinner bezels. I have no idea. To be honest, the bezels are so slim right now, even if Apple reduces them by like another 5 to 10%, probably nobody would notice at that point. And the thickness could line up with rumors of larger batteries and also improved cooling for both the processor, which would get a graphene cover, and a metal chassis or housing basically for the battery itself. So the battery would also be better cooled, which could give you either significantly better longevity for the battery, or for example, much faster peak charging speeds. So this is pretty believable, and I hope that it's actually true, because I do like the sound of everything there. Like, I do like getting a larger screen, larger battery, better cooling for both battery and processors. And if we actually manage to put in a new button, then I'm all on board, especially if it's a camera button, which I've been really rooting for many years. They also point out that the camera bump design is the same. The recent leaks with a fidget spinner-like camera button could be inaccurate based on the CAD we obtained. So this is what we've talked about here, which, yeah, I do not really like this. The upcoming phone houses 3 camera sensors, a LiDAR module, a microphone, and a flash, so that would really line up with before, and you can actually see how they compare those specs similar to what I've outlined: a larger main sensor, higher resolution, ultra wide, etc. They also say that it could come with the larger battery. Now, those battery increases that we've recently gotten as rumors are not that huge. So it remains to be seen to me if like they just make up for the larger display and maybe the more demanding processor, especially if it can get cooled better. That means it can draw more power, and then Apple just says, okay, 5% more battery, so slightly larger screen, slightly more demanding processor, all of that will give you the same effective battery life. Maybe we had some older rumors where the battery size increase would be substantially larger, but those can really be in flux. Apple can change them at pretty much any any given moment between like 5% or something like that. So take it as you will. Now there is a little bit more from actually 91 Mobiles. It's also an exclusive from them. I don't want to spend too much time on it, though it is really interesting. I didn't get to cover it during my hiatus. Those are CAD renders for the iPhone SE 4. Now we don't yet know when this is coming out, but for years we've had like rumors about a potentially like iPhone 11 design based iPhone SE, right? So it would get like a 6.1 inch LCD screen and stuff like that. Well, over the last year we've started hearing a lot more about an OLED based iPhone SE 4 that would take basically the design of the iPhone 13 and 14 frame and then dumb it down in the best ways, right? It would keep basically the same size and even the same bezels as the iPhone 14. That would also mean that it would get like the iPhone 13 generation notch, not the wider one that you had like since the iPhone 10 to the iPhone 12. It would be the full 6.1 inch size, so it would maintain perfect compatibility with apps, supposedly also have the same resolution. And then it gets really interesting because obviously a USB-C port is not an option anymore. It's not just optional anymore. It is a must given EU legislation, but it's still nice to know that the cheapest iPhone would be getting this more future forward-looking port. And it would also be getting the action button, and on the back you'll see it would have only one camera. However, according to rumors, this isn't just any camera. This is the same camera supposedly as on the iPhone 15. If you don't know, the 48 megapixel camera on the iPhone 15 is actually a really modern sensor. It just happens to be a little smaller than on the 14 and 15 Pro Max, but in a lot of characteristic it's really good. So maybe this is it's the same sensor that Apple would use here. Probably depends a little on when this exact device comes out and at what price, but yeah, supposedly this is getting a 48 megapixel camera, so you would have effectively 1 and X and then 2X with a native 12 megapixel output, but you wouldn't have ultra wide, nor would you have like optical zoom. Obviously a lot of other functionality like millimeter wave probably doesn't make its way there. Higher USB-C transfer speeds won't probably make their way to such a cheap device, even though we don't actually even know the pricing. We don't know if it would get like 64 or 128 gigabytes of base storage. Knowing Apple, they probably would want to charge you an extra $50 for 128 gigabytes and start this with 64 and then just hope that nobody buys it. So it's a very interesting device. I'll see how much we actually get to know about this. We've also had like rumors about this being the device where Apple is testing their own modem. So this would be like a modem that supposedly is inferior in many ways to like Qualcomm's latest and greatest, but Apple would feel comfortable introducing it maybe on an iPhone SE because obviously it doesn't quite need the same like peak download speeds as a Pro iPhone. Now, how much that is actually true, whether or not maybe Apple just uses this device internally for testing the modem and does not actually plan to implement the modem right in the SE4, maybe in like an SE5 or something like that, and also how Apple's modem development is going in general. As I said time and time again today, I do not know. I just really wanted to share this with you. This to me looks and feels very realistic. This obviously, as they point out here, will be a significant upgrade over the iPhone SE's current 4.7 inch design with LCD. So I just really wanted to let you know, if you have like long-term plans to get like an iPhone and it really needs to be the cheapest cheapest an iPhone can be, well, this would most likely be a very, very relevant alternative at that point. It supposedly would also get like the exact same battery size as the iPhone 14, so inherent basically a lot of good and proven stuff. Whether or not it gets like the A16 or maybe like in a crazy world an A17, because iPhone SEs at some point used to have the most bleeding edge processors. Again, I cannot promise, but the CAD files of this look pretty good, and this is probably what I would be recommending most people around the $500 price point in the future. I kind of cannot imagine it keeping the $430 price right now. I would expect this to be, especially if it starts with 128 gigabytes of storage, I would expect this to start at $499, very, very likely. Unfortunately, this also suggests we do not have any mini devices, which would be quite nice to have, like an iPhone SE 5.4 inches and then an iPhone SE 6.1 inches, but it is what it is. We take what we can get, especially at this price point. Apple does not give us the highest variety of devices. So again, USB-C, the very, very familiar like speaker microphone layout. So if you basically know the iPhone 14, abstract one camera of it away, take some features away, add some new ones because it's a much newer device than by the time it comes out, and that now you have the iPhone SE 4. Now, this is everything that we sort of gotten while I was on my hiatus. The iPhone 16 capture button discussion, I did discuss a little bit of it in the past. I do want to end with this because this is not just like a rumor breakdown, but it's also kind of a rumor summary for me again. But I would argue this is my appeal to people who wanted to say historically, oh, we don't need, like even Tylos of Tech had like a sketch of Apple historically saying like, oh, let's reduce buttons, oh, now let's add new ones. And I want to say why to me both the action button and the capture button make a lot of sense. Now, the action button, it's very easy to lay out, right? It's because it was just the mute switch, and now it does more than that. I wish it supported like double click functionality, but at least it now offers versatile functionality. And then the capture button is even easier to me because, well, technically not all phones even have like a mute switch, so why should you have a button instead of a mute switch if most devices don't have a mute switch? And to me, the the capture button, I don't know what Apple will end up calling it exactly, but the capture button to me is so exciting. For one, because Apple has really been stingent with like camera shortcut stuff in the OS before the action button. So a lot of Android phones gave you like a customization for like the power button, and yes, with some workarounds you can give the iPhone some of that functionality too, especially with the double and triple tap on the back functionality, but that never works quite as well as a real button. But on Samsung devices you could just double tap. Now on the iPhone, of course, the power button has a lot of extra functionality. It invokes like your Apple Pay stuff, and it obviously turns your device on and off and blah blah blah, right? And you can even have like a triple tap accessibility feature for it. But no, like just what your action button does these days, just open camera at like native view and then use the same button to capture it. And it wouldn't even work that well because technically you still want your power button to be fundamentally a power button. And it's not like you want to lose the functionality of like invoking Apple Pay with double tap, or if you are like some kind of impaired individual when it comes to movement or stuff like that, you do want to have really easy access to accessibility features through triple tapping the power button. But now with the capture button, you wouldn't just have a button that clicks, activates the camera, captures the photo, and that's it. But supposedly this is much better both for photo and video. Now again, we do still have some debates whether it's a mechanical rather than capacitive button, but to me that doesn't really matter. As I said before, I do trust Apple capacitive button designers, knowing how well their Magic Keyboards work. But this is where it gets really cool. It will respond to pressure and touch. So iPhone users will be able to zoom in and out by swiping left and right, or up and down depending on your perspective. Focus with a light press, which to anybody who owns like a real camera, like a DSLR, this is exactly how it works with a shutter button. You press it lightly and then you press it fully to activate it, to actually capture a button. Focus with a light press at that point, and then activate the actual recording with a more forceful press. So this would be, to me, insanely useful, and to actually see all of that stuff now borne out in the leaked schematics, including even more, not even more useful stuff, but other useful stuff like a larger action button. This to me suggests that Apple philosophically, and this is like a really important point to me, people like to have certain ideas about Apple, right? It's because, well, it's the Steve Jobs company, or it's the Jony Ive company. Hell, it's even the Tim Cook company, but Tim Cook is a little more pragmatic than like the diehard philosophically design-obsessed Steve, and especially Jony Ive. Well, to me it suggests that, with obviously Steve being dead for a long time and Jony departing the company a couple of years ago, to me this should suggest we probably will never see that old Apple, but Apple will build upon the foundation that those guys built in probably the most pragmatic ways that we are currently seeing in the industry. And what I mean by that is, like, Apple is keeping that same, like, 3-camera design layout for years and years. It would have been so tempting to do what Samsung does, and basically every 1 or 2 years redesign that so that it really feels like a new generation. But Apple is like, yeah, you know what? We have colors, we have notches on the front, we have dynamic islands on the front, we have slimmer bezels on the front, we have like switch from Lightning to USB-C, we have titanium, stuff like that, we have the action button. There's plenty to visually differentiate our product from the last. We have a really good algorithm like between the cameras. We really are comfortable with like the internal layout, right, where the motherboard sits and stuff like that, where the antenna is right now. And historically, Apple would have also probably been, like under Steve or Jony, probably obsessed with like making sure that those lines on the sides at some point disappear. Yeah, when Steve introduced the iPhone 4, he said like, oh, well, it doesn't look like Apple, right? But yeah, he was right. It didn't look like Apple. It looked weirdly asymmetrically. It looked somewhat weird, and it still does, to be honest. But guess what? It makes the antenna really awesome, and Apple has stuck with the design now for well over a decade, and now they have like much better 5G modems. So Apple went from being one of the companies with the worst cellular connectivity, especially when they had much smaller smartphones as well, to one of the best. Pretty much every time a new iPhone comes out, the new Pro iPhone becomes the best cellular connectivity iPhone. And in fact, they used like their advancements in cellular connectivity to be like the only major smartphone manufacturer that offers like a worldwide satellite connectivity. Samsung wanted to offer this with the S24 series, but came up short. They didn't want to put their Exynos chip and modem into the S24 Ultra, but then they didn't have that functionality even on devices that did have the Exynos chip. So then it doesn't make sense, right? If it isn't in your most high-end flagship model, why would you give it to the cheaper models? And those models also don't have quite the same cellular connectivity. So I'm digressing, but I'm trying to say that Apple has now proven to me time and time again, when they introduced the M1 Max and M1 Pro and M1 Max based MacBook Pro, they've shown to me that they're very fine with making the device a little thicker, returning old ports, all that stuff, right, to give us a better experience. And yeah, they will do fun stuff like giving us notches on laptops. We still don't fully know why, but it's not like they're a big hindrance given how the menu bar is designed. But Apple will still be Apple, but Apple will also listen. And to me, this idea that Apple will be giving us not just an extra button for camera stuff, because obviously companies like Sony do that, but now Apple also puts like their own unique twist on it with like capacitive feedback and with the ability to zoom in and out, and with the ability to lightly press and then forcefully press, similar to how you would on a DSLR. That to me is actually extremely promising, especially if it turns out true that this device is also the device where Apple finally listens when it comes to significantly improved like processor and battery cooling. That to me would suggest, especially together with like the fact that Apple has kept the base Pro iPhone price ever since 2017, right? $999 on the iPhone 10 and then $999 on the iPhone 15 Pro. If Apple even keeps those prices still the same, or at least only marginally increases prices on the 16 Pro, but then at $1099 you also get 256 gigabytes, just as you now get 256 gigabytes on the $1199 iPhone 15 Pro, which yes is the same as on like the last generation, but at least there's no effective price increase for anybody wanting 256 gigabytes. Well, that to me would suggest that Apple is really willing to listen, really willing to improve value, and I don't like kissing their asses. I have criticized them time and time again for everything from, like, as I've said, cheaping out in the past on cooling across devices, even on stuff like the MacBook Air, cheaping out on stuff like the SSD storage in the M2 devices. Still not giving us at least 12 gigabytes of memory even on M3 Max. So I can really criticize Apple. However, today is a very positive stream to me, in the sense that I really want to cover like better value MacBook Air than before, right? iPhone 16 supposedly getting some nice but not groundbreaking design changes, and then the 16 Pro actually giving us also better usability in general. Also, it's something that I've had forgotten to mention, but supposedly the iPhone 16 would be getting the action button as well. Now, what you see here in the schematics is not actually the capture button. It's not, at least as I understand it. This would just be the millimeter wave cutout. But again, I wouldn't put too much trust in these leaked schematics. Regardless, this is basically everything I had to talk about today. We came out a little under an hour. I'm pretty happy about that. As I've promised in the beginning of this week, I will be coming on more often. I really tried to hold out on making a new video until the M3 iPad Pro came out, but I was in the mood to make some extra content, and hopefully the M3 iPad Pro follows quickly on like Monday or Tuesday, and I'll definitely be right on top of that. Please let me know what you want to see me comment on next. Please subscribe to this channel if you enjoy the content. Please like, share, comment, and if you want to support this channel directly, you can either send live or super chat or a super sticker, or if you want to subscribe to me, you can also do so for money on Patreon, where there's also, I believe, a free trial version version. There isn't too much extra content on that, but I will be working on that over time. This is why I also made it a little cheaper than it was before, so it feels like a more appropriate value, similar to what Apple has been doing with the MacBook Air. This is Mark Tech. I really enjoyed hanging out with you guys. See you guys next time. Thank you, and this is me tuning out.